Okay, folks, so I'll make a start. And I'd just like to thank you all again for coming along this evening. I hope you're all keeping well and are looking forward to tonight's talk. And it's going to be about mountain safety, specifically looking at the winter environment. So my name's Ben. I'm the part-time mountain safety advisor for Mountaineering Scotland, and I work alongside Heather Morning, who I'm sure a lot of you will know. She's been working in that department for a very long time, very experienced, so it's great to be able to work under her wing as such. So who is Mountaineering Scotland if you're not familiar with them? We're an organisation that is partly funded by Sport Scotland that help to deliver skills courses, and they range from navigation to winter skills to avalanche awareness. And if you're a member, then you can get access to these courses at a subsidised cost. So, you know, it's worth looking into to become a member for Mountaineering Scotland, because there's lots of other additional benefits and discounts to outdoor shops as well. And it's a great price. And if you join as well, you get a little freebie present or goodie bag, depending on what you're after whenever you join. So just something to bear in mind. So tonight's talk, you know, it's about snow and avalanche and kind of avalanche safety. And we need to just start off looking a little bit at snow. Why is it a danger? Why is it a potential hazard to us when we venture into the mountains in the winter? And you can see in this photograph here, where the sun's shining down on the snow, there looks like there's been a bit of an avalanche. And you know, what is an avalanche? It's basically something that has happened in the snow, causing a layer of snow to slide down the hillside. And you can just see here that red line marks where that avalanche has started from, and it slid down the hill and eventually stopped with all that pile of kind of rubbly snow just built up at the bottom there. So it's quite a large area of snow. And you can see here in this image as well, it's on a bigger scale. This is Corrie and Lochan in the Cairngorms, and this is called or referred to as the Great Slab. And this is what we'd call a full depth avalanche because it's to the ground. You can see there in that red line where it started from and where it's tracked its way down the hillside. And just to give you a bit of scale and reference as to the size of some of the snow that has accumulated and fallen down the hillside. That's just to give you a little bit of a scale as to the size of how some avalanches can be in Scotland. You know, so you might want to think about, well, I don't want to be involved in something of that scale. So tonight is looking about how we can carefully, you know, avoid putting ourselves in those kind of risky areas in the mountains. So to think about an avalanche, it needs ingredients. We're going to make a bit of a recipe here. So this needs 3 things for an avalanche to happen. And that can be weak or unstable snow. Generally in the winter time, you get various levels of snow and you get like a weak layer somewhere within a profile of snow. You need avalanche terrain, and that can be anywhere where an avalanche can start, can move down the mountain, and then eventually stop. And then you need a trigger, and that can be us as individuals who go out into the mountains, or it can be more snow on top of what's already there. So another question to think about is how much snow do you need for an avalanche to happen? And you can see in this picture here, there's various amounts of snow within the mountainside. There's a hill there that doesn't look like it has much snow, but you need something that looks sufficiently smooth, like this slope here. It looks pretty covered. There isn't much ground poking out, which hopefully can, you know, bring your attention to there is more snow there that could be potentially hazardous. So looking at the avalanche terrain, it can vary in complexity. So this is a picture of the north face of Ben Nevis, and there's lots of complex terrain and a lot of challenges to navigate your way in through this environment, especially in the winter time, because there's lots of different slopes that kind of join onto each other, lots of gullies, and lots to think about. Avalanche terrain can also be something like the Cairngorm Plateau. So this is looking across to Cairntoul and Breriac from Ben Macdui. Nice rolling hills, but there's still large areas of snow that can be accumulated into avalanche terrain, like corries and bowls and rolling hills like this. And again, this picture, this is the Larry Grew looking across to Ben Macdui. Doesn't look like there's much snow, so you might think, oh, there's maybe not that much of an avalanche risk there, but on closer inspection, there's certainly areas that there's isolated patches of snow that could, potentially cause an avalanche to happen. So little isolated areas that you may need to think about on your travels as well. So just diving a little bit further into avalanche terrain and avalanche hazards. There are various different things we need to think about. It's not just a slope that an avalanche can happen that you could get caught in. It's, other shapes and features of the land around you. So for example, you have valleys, they can be large or small. So a classic example could be the Calamine Gap in the Cairngorms. It's a small scale valley that could trap a lot of snow if it were to avalanche. A number of years ago, there was an unfortunate avalanche that happened in there because it was so small and narrow that the snow came down one side, down into the bottom and kind of partly up the other side. And there was a couple of fatalities in there a number of years ago. Steep cliffs and drop-offs, depending on where you are in your travels. If an avalanche were to happen above you, you have to think where you are in relation to that avalanche and what's beneath you as well. That could be quite consequential terrain. Run-out zones at the bottom of a slope. So you may think, oh, I'm quite safe down here, but you have to think about what's above you and who is above you at the time. So it's just other things to bear in mind. Complex terrain, there's lots of boulders, cliffs, steep drops. It's not fairly uniform, and you've got to think about where you are in relation to that again. And a big thing in Scottish winter is cornices, so wind-blown snow that's transported over a mountainside that creates false ground. Then with an additional load, such as a skier walker, on top of that could cause it to potentially collapse. And then convexities anywhere that there's a high stress point on a mountainside. So these are some of the things that we need to think about when traveling into the mountains. Where are we going and what potential hazards are there, and how do we look at trying to avoid those hazards to be able to have a good day on the mountainside. So a little bit of a quiz for you, and you can answer this just at home in your own mind, or share a wee bit of a discussion with someone. So avalanches need a particular angle of slope to actually happen on. And the question is, what is the range of angles do you think? So is it between 5 and 10 degrees, between 90 and 100? Have a guess as to where you think that range of angles is. And there's a very particular angle, which is kind of your optimum or prime angle for an avalanche to happen. And what do you think that angle is? So I'll give you a wee minute just to sort of mull that over. So the answer is going to be on the next slide, which is coming up right now. So there you go. So anywhere really between 25 and 60 degrees is a range of angles that avalanches can occur, but the kind of real danger scale is between 30 and 45 And then the prime angle, the optimum angle, is around 37 degrees. Now, that's not to say that if you were standing on a slope of between 25 and 29 degrees that you're going to be safe. If you notice there in the wording, it says that they're rare. It doesn't mean that no avalanches can happen. They do happen under particular circumstances. So you just have to bear that in mind also. But the range of angles is somewhere between 30 and 45. And that's where we need to really kind of think about in our days out in the mountains, what type of slopes and angles are we venturing onto. So another way to think about, a bit of an analogy to think about how an avalanche actually happens is looking at a sponge cake. So you got this really nice sponge cake, and you can think that you have a older or firm layer of snow, or even the ground, and then you have a weaker, unstable layer of snow, which could be, you know, a softer layer of snow, some type of crystal, depending on what it is. And then you could have fresh wind-blown snow, generally referred to as wind slab, sitting on top of all of that. Now, if you have that sponge cake sitting on a table, a very flat table, it's absolutely fine. You know, there's no danger of it falling. But if you put that sponge cake at a particular angle, say anywhere between 30 and 45 degrees, then potentially what's going to happen is that weak layer isn't going to be able to support that heavier top layer. And the result is going to be that top layer can give way. Now, it could give way by itself under its own weight, or as us, as hill walkers, climbers, or skiers, if we put ourselves as an additional load on top, then we could then cause that to eventually slide. So avalanche triggers, they generally refer to us as individuals when we venture out into the mountains. So if we want to get up into the high mountains, we may need to cross challenging terrain, complex terrain, or slopes that are potentially have snow on them. Could be skiers, ski tours. Generally, people who ski want to ski down those slopes that are covered in beautiful powder to create fresh tracks and just have a good time out. Or climbers, if we're going winter climbing, a lot of the time we have to access the climbs going up a steep slope, like a crag apron, to get to the base of a climb. So all of these elements we need to think about, you know, where is the snow? Are we putting ourselves at risk by venturing into this terrain? And how can we look at figuring it out if it's safe to do so? And that's what we're going to explore more. So day-to-day life, whatever we do, there's always elements of risk involved, and there's hazards out there. So this picture, you know, am I taking a risk by sticking my tongue on an electric fence? Yes, I probably am, because it's a real hazard to getting an electric shock. So the next picture is a little video I want to show you. So it happens pretty quickly here, so just pay attention to what happens. So pretty risky business there. You know, somebody skydiving, and this was off Ben Nevis 2 summers ago, I believe. So you have to think about there the probability of success versus the consequences of failure. And it's a pretty high consequence if it went wrong, but it's a calculated risk based on knowledge and experience of what that person can do. So I want to kind of look at sort of what is risk and what are hazards to us when we venture out into the mountains. And a hazard, you can think of it in a very basic sense, is a source of potential harm to us. And in the winter environment, this could be an avalanche itself, the terrain that we travel on, the weather that we encounter throughout the day, and other people in the mountain as well. They're all potential sources of harm to us, and they're hazardous to us. The only time they become a real issue for us is when we expose ourselves to those hazards. So you have to think about risk in a sense of the probability between 0 and 100%, 0 being that nothing's going to happen to you because you haven't exposed yourself to the hazards, to 100% certainty that you are at real risk because you're putting yourself into a dangerous situation. And then you have to think about the consequences. What's the impact of that risk that if you're venturing out into avalanche terrain? So if we want to have really good days out in the mountainside and go explore the winter environment and really enjoy ourselves, whether traveling along technical ridge lines or just big days out in the beautiful environment, we need to think about certain things to make it a good, safe day. And that starts from making consistently good decisions to have a safe day in the mountains. Now, I want to actually give you a little bit of a story of a day out that myself and my wife had a number of years ago that just had a lot of little poor decisions that ended up in us having a bit of a poor day out, a bit of a bad day out. So I'm just going to kind of show you and explain to you this little story that we had. So we wanted to go and do these 3 Munros up kind of northwest, just on that past Ben Rinnes. So Ben Jerrig, Conamiel, and Fasgua. Now, looking at it, it's quite a big day. We thought, oh yeah, we could do this. This is fine. You know, it's a big day. We're fairly fit and we're capable of being able to actually go and do these 3 Munros in one day. Now, the first poor decision that we made was to start quite late on in the day. Now, the weather forecast for the day didn't look that bad. It was suggesting some drizzly rain and then showers. So yeah, we can be prepared for that. We can stick our waterproofs in our bags. And it was suggesting then maybe cloudy in the morning and then, you know, clearing up in the afternoon. So we thought, oh, it's okay. It's not too bad. A weather forecast, so we're kind of prepared for that. So just thinking about our first poor decision was starting late on in the day. So this is us walking into Ben Jerrig. You can see the summit is off in the distance there. Doesn't look too far away. It looks, oh, that's reasonable. We can get there in good time. So where this photograph is taken is where that little yellow dot is. So you can, from that little yellow dot on the map, Ben Jerrig is only 1 to 2.5 kilometers away. We were there at about 11 o'clock. We eventually reached the summit of Ben Jerrig, which is there, at 2:30. So that was 3.5 hours for only traveling 2.5 kilometers, which is very, very slow. And it was getting late on in the day. The weather forecast hadn't really developed or improved to be any better. We had almost run out of food because we hadn't really taken that much with us, thinking that we could actually get around these 3 Munros fairly quickly. And I just want to show you a little video of kind of the conditions and what we felt like once we reached the summit. So you can see there, we'd reached the first summit really late on in the day. You know, it was soon to be getting dark. We were kind of almost out of food, and we still had 2 more Munros to go. So we just made the decision to turn around and go back down and get back safely to the car before it got dark. But there's lots of little poor decisions made. You know, it was very last minute, starting late on in the day, and then sort of being a little bit over ambitious and really trying to think we could get 3 Munros done in such a short space of time, considering whenever the sun was setting as well. So it's a little bit of a story that just kind of gives you an idea of poor decisions that were made that ended up in a big change for us to then get back off the mountain. Because if we carried on, most likely we'd have been carrying on into the dark, and that would have then just exacerbated everything for us, having no food and, you know, just getting colder and wetter in those conditions that didn't improve, even though the forecast was suggesting an improvement. So going back to this idea, to have successful days in the mountains is about making consistently good decisions. So the question is, how do we go about making these good decisions? And it's about being a detective. Whether you are a Miss Marple fan, a Poirot, or a good old Sherlock Holmes fan, they all do the same thing. They all investigate, they all observe, they all spend that time gathering information to then figure out what has happened. And it's the same for us. We need to spend that time planning and making sure we've got enough information to then come up with a good decision about going out into the mountains. So I don't know if anybody has read this book. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a very good book called The Checklist Manifesto, and it basically looks at the idea of how and why pilots and surgeons have checklists to follow in order that they do everything really well, really safe, and that they haven't missed anything out in their checklists, either pre-flight or during a flight or during a potential accident. So it made me think, well, if pilots and surgeons have checklists, then surely we as mountaineers, climbers, skiers, surely we should have some form of checklist to be able to follow to make sure that we haven't missed anything out. And lo and behold, we do. And that comes in the form of the Be Avalanche Aware decision-making process. Now, you can get this online if you go to the Avalanche Information Service, or you can download it as an app for your phone. And it's a really useful resource that just helps you think a bit more about your planning for heading out into the mountains. And we're going to look into this a little bit more as to how it can be used for us. So you have 3 key stages in the Be Avalanche Aware process. You have your planning, the journey itself that you do, and then key places, and that basically refers to anywhere a decision needs to be made whilst you're on your journey. But in each of these 3 key stages, you need to think about certain things, and that is the avalanche and the weather for the day, you and your group, and what skill you have, and how fit you're feeling, and what equipment that you need for the day, and then the landscape that you intend to visit. Have you been there before? Is it a complex environment? You know, just you need to think about those things. Are there steep slopes? Is there a lot of snow there? So we're going to look at the first element, which is the planning and what the weather is like in that environment. So, so if we imagine that we want to go on a particular mountain somewhere, where do we get that information from? You know, where do we want to go to find a good route up a mountain? So it could be a Munro guidebook, it could be Walking Highlands, you could be looking at a map, looking at a particular Munro or Corbett that you want to go and do. And I think it's always a good idea to not get blinkered into one particular plan for one area. Think of having multiple plans in different areas. So if you want to go to the Cairngorms, don't just think that I want to go do Ben McDooey. it might just be that you've got other objectives in that area. Or same for Northwest, don't just think that you want to go and climb Ben A. You might have other area objectives in that area as well. So come up with multiple plans from multiple areas. So once you've got that sort of idea, you need to then think about what's the weather like in that area. So there's loads of different online resources for searching for the weather. Some are better than others. Some give just a very general overview. But probably the most two common that we would use would be the top two, the Mountain Weather Information Service and the Met Office. Now, they both are really good, but at the same time, they have disadvantages and advantages. The Mountain Weather Information Service covers large areas that they forecast for, generally at a height of about 900 meters, which is kind of the height of most Munros. And it's really good that they will give you a little bit more detail at that altitude, and will also tell you how the weather will feel on you physically, rather than just giving you facts and figures. So it's nice that they give you a little bit of input in that respect. The Met Office is very much facts and figures. It will give you numbers, but it's very good that they will give you a bit more of a specific mountain forecast. So you can go into their specialist forecasts and type in the name of a summit of a Munro or Corbett, something like that, and that will give you a forecast for that mountain itself rather than a larger area. So putting them both together just helps create a bit more of a colourful picture as to what is happening in that area and on that particular mountain as well. So I would always suggest having a look through multiple forecasts and trying to come up with a common theme through all of them. So now that we've got our weather in the winter, we need to look at then what is the snow doing and what is the ground conditions like. So this is where we would look at the Scottish Avalanche Information Service, and they forecast 6 different areas, which are generally considered to be probably the more popular areas that people would travel to or have kind of the more grand big mountains. So I think this is a quiz time. So the question is, what percentage of victims trigger their own avalanche? Is it 5%, 15%? So the next slide will show the answer. So there you go, 90% of victims trigger their own avalanche. So tonight we have about 300 people viewing this talk, which is great. Thanks for joining. So 90% of that 300 is about what, 270 people. So out of that 300, 270 of us will potentially trigger our own avalanche. So there's only 30 people watching that would be lucky enough not to trigger their own avalanche. So if you think about it, that's a massive number, really quite high. So we need to think about how we can prevent that from happening. So if we have a role in causing an avalanche, then we have a role in avoiding them, okay? And that's based on making good decisions. So just looking at some statistics, just to get you to kind of think about that between the winter of 2017 and 2018, there was 30 avalanches triggered by people, and 19 of them were on what's called a considerable forecast. We'll look at that a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's a high number on a high forecast, okay, and you'll hopefully get a clear understanding of what that means once we go a little bit further into the talk. So avalanche hazard scale has different levels, going from low, moderate, considerable, high, and very high. And this description will tell you what, how easy it is for an avalanche to occur, and kind of the size of the avalanche that could happen as well if you trigger it. So low being only small to medium are possible, human triggering possible, but it may happen under particular circumstances, where if you go to high, it says natural and human triggered avalanches will occur, in some cases large to very large. So there's quite a big jump in what can happen there. But if you look at the black, it says very high. Historically in Scotland, in the avalanche forecasting, there's never really been a very high avalanche forecast. Okay, if you look at where considerable is, you could almost see that it's somewhere in the middle. It's kind of like the middle ground. And those 19 avalanches that happened in 2017, 2018 winter happened on a considerable forecast. So it's kind of in the middle ground. And sometimes I think what can happen is people can look at that and think, oh, it's in the middle, it's okay. We can chance it, because it's not quite high enough and it's not quite, low enough. It's somewhere in the middle, so we're okay. A different way to look at it is if you remove black altogether, if you remove that black altogether, all of a sudden, considerable jumps up a level. It's kind of divided. It's on the lower end of the higher scale. Okay, so maybe start thinking about that. A considerable avalanche forecast is really quite a high forecast. If I were to say to you, if you're in your house, wherever you are right now, that if you were to stand up and walk out your front door, that there was a considerable chance of you getting punched in the face, you might not want to take that chance. You might want to look for an alternative way out of your house to avoid that risk. Okay, so considerable chance is a high chance of something happening, and it's up to us to play our role to make good decisions to avoid being caught out and putting ourselves into a considerable avalanche risk. So whenever you go onto the Avalanche Information Service, if you click on a particular area, whether that's Torridon, the Northern Cairngorms, wherever it may be, you'll get this image and the detail, and you can start to rummage your way through that to siphon out all the key information that is going to help you make your decision for the day. Now you've got this nice colourful diagram, call it a pizza, a biscuit, wheel of fortune. They generally call it a rose diagram, and it lets you know where on the hill hazards are. Now it gives you very limited information. So that's kind of what it looks like if you download it as a PDF and you want to print it out. So same information, just different format. So if we just look at this this pizza diagram, if we look at it, how much information does that tell me? It doesn't really tell me that much. Okay, it's very limited in what it's informing me of. And it only really tells me two things. It tells me the aspect, which refers to whether or not it's north, south, east, or west, whatever slope the snow is sitting on, what direction it's facing. And it tells me the altitude, where the hazard potentially changes from low, moderate, considerable. And those numbers can change on the outside. The inner number will always refer to the highest mountain in that forecast area. So this one here is for the Northern Cairngorms and Ben Macdui. So it'll be different if you're over West Coast on Ben Nevis. But those other numbers will always change. So it's very limited information just alone if you just look at that diagram. I think there was a while back the Avalanche Information Service website that can look at how long people spend looking through the website. And I think the average time was somewhere between 30 to 40 seconds, which makes you think that people were probably only looking at that diagram and then basing their day or their journey just on a diagram that only tells you two things. So it only informs you of where a problem on the mountain is, but it doesn't tell you what the hazards are on the mountain. It doesn't tell you, if there's weak layers in the snow. It doesn't tell you what is actually happening. So you need to be that detective and dive a little bit further into the forecast and investigate much more. So that's why it's really important that whenever you look at your avalanche forecast, you're looking at the observed forecast, the information that's actually written, because it's fact, it's based on human observation. So the avalanche forecasters, they go out on a day-to-day basis throughout the winter. They'll journey around the mountainside and look and observe at what the snow is doing, where it's sitting on the mountain, and if it's being blown around, pushed around, and look at where the high risk areas are. They'll also dig into the snow, they'll dig a bit of a profile, measure the temperature, they'll have a poke around, but it only gives them a small snapshot of what's actually happening, but they use that information to create a bigger picture. And then they'll type it all up, and then this is what we get. So we get that information that we can then take all that information from. So this observed, it gives us what the hazards are, and then we can put that together. Further on from that, we've also got these snow stability observations, which are really useful to see as well. So you've got these little icons which indicate whether or not you have snow being continually blown around the mountain, or if there is a weak layer somewhere still within the snow, and then if cornices are prone to collapse. So you can look and see what those are as well. So it's really important to put all of that information together. So some questions that are really useful to ask yourself whenever you're actually looking at the avalanche forecast is, what are the avalanche problems? And that's looking at the detail in the observed avalanche forecast. And then thinking about where those problems are in relation to what aspect and at what altitude on the mountain. And then thinking about what is the likelihood or the probability of those avalanches occurring, and what size are they? Are they sort of widespread? Are they, all across the mountain, or are they just in localized pockets? So you do have to gather a lot of information through the forecast to be able to see what's happening in the mountain and where it's happening. So if we were to put that information onto a map, so this is the map of Cairngorm, and we've got a avalanche forecast. You can see here we've got a low forecast for up to 950 meters. So that kind of squiggly green snake is around 900 meters. So anything up to that point is low risk. Then you can start to look at the other aspects of where on the mountain you've got moderate levels of risk. So if you look, that aspect is facing west, as is this aspect. So they're kind of parts of the mountain that you could start to think about, right, I don't want to go there. I want to avoid, that punch in the face if it's a moderate or considerable punch in the face. And then you've got these other aspects which are considerable. Once you can start to get your eye into this, and you can start to then rule out those slopes that are potentially hazardous for you to travel on, you can start to think, well, where is safe? Where is appropriate for me to travel? And a way of thinking about that is ridge lines. Ridges or bridges, they're generally kind of safer places to travel because the wind will have blown or scarred all the snow off those ridge lines, and those ridge lines fall in between those safer areas. Now, technology is a fantastic thing. It's great to have it. And if you've never used this app before or online resource, it's called FatMap. And it's a really good visual reference to be able to see what's happening on the mountainside. So this is a 3D image with an overlay of slopes that are at a particular angle that then actually tie in with the forecast. So you can see those kind of oranges and yellows and reds on those slopes that are facing the similar aspects as to the avalanche forecast. And then the green are the kind of the lower risk areas. So you can start to see here where our safer ridge lines, our safer areas of travel may be, and we can start to then think about this in our planning stage using the Be Avalanche Aware process. And here's a good example of a wind-scarred ridge line. So you can see the wind has been blowing from the left to the right, and then increasing the risk of hazard on that right-hand side. So you can clearly see that's somewhere that you want to avoid. So we're still in the planning stage. We're just going to move on to you and your party's personal skill and experience and what you have to be able to sort of head out into the mountainside. These pictures probably normally dictate or kind of are showing a particular normal Scottish winter. I think we've been quite lucky through January to have very settled weather, but these pictures are showing a typical Scottish day. But you can see that the people in these photographs, they look really well prepared. They're wrapped up in their good winter jackets. They've got big heavy gloves on. They've got their ski goggles on. So they're pretty comfortable and pretty relaxed in that environment. Sorry, I paused it there, apologies. So again, you can see in that little video, all the people there, they're pretty well equipped. They're wrapped up well, big gloves on, got their ski goggles. Their maps and compasses are folded up nice and neatly. They're manageable and small enough to tuck away in a jacket pocket somewhere. But the other important thing in that video is, they look comfortable. They don't look sort of out of place. So they look like they've got the skills to be in that environment. So just some food for thought, thinking about, what do you carry out in the mountains with you to be prepared for that weather? Having, multiple pairs of gloves, if a pair gets wet or a pair blow away, you've got another alternative pair to put on. You've got, some goggles or glasses to keep the snow and the wind out, a buff and a hat, spare layers, good heavy waterproofs, good pair of boots, maybe a walking pole to help with balance if it's a wee bit windy, and then lots of dry bags, which is really useful just to help compartmentalize everything, but also to keep it dry, because even though you've got a big heavy duty rucksack, it may not last that long in terms of its waterproofness. So having things in little dry bags is very good to just keep everything a little bit drier as well. And you can just see here, these two chaps who are climbing, they look comfortable, they look happy to be out in that environment because they've got the skills and competency to be in that environment. And I think it's really important in the winter as well that your navigation is really up to scratch as well. And then you can see in the image there, their map and compass is quite small, looks quite neat and tidy, something to easily stick away in a pocket. And of course, your other essentials to carry whilst you're out in the mountain is your ice axe, and then arguably a snow shovel, depending on what you're doing that day. They are handy to have. If you just need to dig a wee hole just to keep out of the wind, or dig some snow up to create a bit of a shelter, or if you are in the unfortunate event of being in an avalanche situation, at least you've got something there to dig with. And it's a personal choice to carry it if you're out and about, but something to think about is if you need to dig in an emergency and you need to dig an emergency shelter, think about what's going to dig faster, the end of an ice axe or a shovel. So just some food for thought. I think one thing that I would really strongly encourage people to carry if they don't carry it or buy it is a survival bag, not a blanket, but a bag. One of the cheap £6 plastic bags. They're a real lifesaver. There was a story a good number of years ago of two people who were caught out in the winter environment. One had a cheap plastic survival bag. They got into it. The other person didn't. The other person survived but was hypothermic. The other person who didn't have the bag, unfortunately, they lost their life. So they're cheap as chips and they're a real lifesaver just to help keep the wind off your body. And then if you don't already have one as a group shelter, again, there are fantastic pieces of kit, and they just live in the bottom of your rucksack. You can get various sizes from 2-man to 4-man to 8-man, and they're if you're out on the Cairngorm Plateau and it's a wee bit windy and chilly, you can just get into it to have your sandwiches or put an extra layer on. And psychologically, they make such a big difference to people who are feeling a wee bit chilly. A lot of the time, I think people think of them only to be used in an emergency, but they can be used anytime, and they're well worth buying if you don't have it. And I guess being a member of Mountaineering Scotland, you can get discounts in shops, so they can come in at a little bit of a cheaper price as well. So just some food for thought, some kit to maybe consider carrying in your bag when you're out in the mountain environment, whether it's the winter or the summer. Clothing can change over time, and I think it's really important to spend that extra bit of time researching into the equipment that you want to buy that's going to look after you, rather than just going for what's the latest fashion and realizing it has no function or purpose whatsoever. So through time and history, clothes do change for the better. So don't just jump the gun and go and buy what looks the most colorful and cool looking. Just spend your time thinking about what is the most functional. And further on to that, just think about what color are you wearing in the mountainside. A lot of outdoor shops have an abundance of dark colors, which are just useless for being out in the mountainside. If you need to call mountain rescue and you want to be seen from a distance, bright colors are so much better. So consider that as well if you're purchasing new equipment. If you want to go into further detail and you want to look at a little bit more information about choosing equipment, whether it's boots for winter, crampons for winter, and ice axes, Mountaineering Scotland have brought out some new videos that are on YouTube now that are really useful. Glenmore Lodge YouTube channel is also a great place on researching on how to use the equipment, from ice axe arrest to how to use your crampons effectively as well. So two great resources to utilize, just to give you some more information as well there. So moving on to, we're in our planning stage, we want to look at the landscape that we want to visit, okay? And just give you some examples of considerations and things that you may need to think about when planning a day in the mountains. So we're going to look at this particular route from Walking Highlands that shows Benahurin, which is a nice Mount Munro, just to the west of Craigmeggy. So on a nice summer day, this route takes you between the summit and the top. On closer inspection, on a straight line, that route takes you across some steep ground. Now, it may look on the map, kind of innocuous, but on a image there, you can see. Apologies, sorry. You can see there that on a 3D image, that red line actually takes you over that steep ground. Okay. On a clear day, in the summer, that's fine. You can avoid it, no problem at all. But how does that pose a threat to us? How is that a hazard to us in the winter environment? So this is the summit of Benahurin in winter. And you can see to the skiers' right, there's a lot of snow has built up from the wind blowing from the left and creating those cornices, which creates false ground. Back in 2018, there were 3 fatalities of people walking through cornices and walking across them thinking that it was real ground, and subsequently that additional load on the snow caused it to collapse. So it can be a real hazard to us in the winter. So we need to think about how we can have a strategic plan to avoid them. On a day like this, in this photograph, it's absolutely fine. You can ski around it and you can navigate your way around it. But if you have a day like this, where it's completely white out and you have no visual reference to go off, you're going to have to actually do a little bit more navigating and be a little bit more careful in getting from one summit to the next. So a little bit of a navigation strategy could be to do a dog leg and avoid those steep contours and take yourself away from any hazards. So that's just a bit of an example and a consideration to have, and you can do this in the comfort of your own home, the day before or a couple of days before you plan to go out into the mountains. And you can sit there with your cup of tea and just spend a little bit more time investigating and looking a little bit more detail on the journey that you want to take, and thinking about what are the hazards that are potentially there to catch you off guard. So throughout the talk so far, I've talked about 3 A's, and your question is, what are these 3 A's? So our first one is aspect, and that refers to any slope and what direction it's facing, whether it's east, north, south, west. And that altitude refers to at what altitude would a considerable or moderate avalanche risk be at on our avalanche diagram. And then the angle of the slope that we are potentially walking on or trying to avoid. But the problem with angle is looking at a map. I have no way of telling what angle a slope is just by looking at an Ordnance Survey or Harvey's map. I don't know. Looking at the ground when you're actually out on the mountain, you could look and you could guess, but you don't really know for sure. So the question is, how can we find that out? And there's a general rule of thumb that we can follow that is a really useful little tip to then get you to think about where hazards may lie in the mountain. And that is this idea of missing contours. So if you look closely at an Ordnance Survey map, you've got your index contours, and you'll have 4 skinny contours in between. Now, cartographers will have to close those contours closer and closer together to indicate steep ground, but they'll get to a point where they can't actually include all 4 contour lines, so they have to exclude some. And whenever that starts to happen, you're encroaching on 30-degree slopes. And you can easily measure that by using your millimeter rule on your compass. So if it's 2 millimeters between the 2 index contours, it's roughly 30 degrees. But at 1 to 25, it's going to be 4 degrees. So it's a good rule of thumb to follow, even in the summertime. So I think Heather, over the years of her being in mountain rescue, had gathered all the information of where incidents and accidents had occurred. Mountain rescue will generally take a grid reference of where that happens. And then she had seen that a lot of these incidents are happening on areas that there's a contour missing. So majority of the time, incidents and accidents are happening on 30-degree slopes. So it's a good rule of thumb to follow whenever you're planning, and even when you're out in the mountain, to follow. So just looking at this photograph here, you can see that this slope, which is in Corrian Loughin, you can see it's an avalanche slope. if you look closely at the Ordnance Survey map of that slope, you can see that there are locations where there are missing contours. And then even there, just the contours are getting very close together that could almost be excluded. And that's a 30-degree slope. And we'd said earlier that avalanches can happen anywhere between 30 and 45. And that kind of ties in, you know, if there's missing contours, it's getting onto 30-degree slope. And the picture shows an avalanche having happened on that slope. So we're going to move on to kind of things that we need to think about on our journey stage. The planning stage is a massive part. I would say it's about 70 to 75% of your effort goes into your planning. The more effort and time you can put into that and make better decisions based on those plans, you're probably going to have a better day in the mountains. But whilst we're on our journey, we still need to think about whether or not the plans that we had, looking at the forecast and the snow conditions on our journey, does it tie in? Does it fit? And then we're going to just look at some things that we need to think about, that it's the mountain's way of telling us if it's safe to be out there or not. So I would call these kind of the red flags of instability. So if you're out around the mountain, and if you see any recent avalanche activity, that's kind of Mother Nature's way of telling you that it's potentially unsafe and a hazardous time to be out in the mountains. And you can see some of the scale of the avalanche debris here that this person's standing in. It's quite a large area, and it's fairly recent. So just a warning sign saying there may be more activity or more avalanches likely to happen. Shooting cracks or other instability, weaknesses that happen under your feet as you travel, whether it be on skis or foot. You know, if you're walking along and you start getting these cracks appearing and then disappearing off down the mountain, that's referred to as propagation. And it's just the snow and the mountain telling you that it's really weak, really unstable, and you're probably in the wrong place. So you need to really consider your life choices and whether or not you want to carry on your journey on that particular slope. And again, there's just another example. Some other things to consider are big temperature changes. So if you've got heavy rain, that's going to increase the weight of the snow and potentially cause things to collapse. So we had a lot of snow and then all of a sudden it's warmed up recently, and there's been a lot of avalanche activity in the Cairngorms, particularly Cornices. There was quite a large avalanche happened there. And it's probably just a lot of that snow sitting in the gullies and in the crag aprons up to the crags. That then the increased temperature and the rain has just increased its weight and it's just went down the mountain. So these are the considerations you need to think about whilst you're out the mountain as well. Heavier drifting snow. How much snow has fallen over the last 24 hours, 48 hours. There's a real thumb. If you get a lot of heavy snow over that period of time, it's a good idea not to go out in the mountains straight after. We had that unfortunate incident a number of years ago where there were 4 Europeans on Ben Nevis, and they got caught in an avalanche in number 5 Gully, and 3 of them unfortunately lost their lives. And there was a big storm event the day before, so the area was just loaded with snow, almost like a gun waiting to go off, and they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rapid temperature increase as well. So if you're seeing signs of roller balls happening, things like that, it's just an indication of the environment and the mountain telling you that their instability is increasing. So cornices could be prone to collapse as well. So you need to think about where your journey may take you on that mountain and where you are in relation to those hazards. So just moving on and kind of coming to a close is looking at this idea of what a key place is. And basically that's somewhere where a decision needs to be made about the day itself. And that can start from the car park. So whenever you arrive to your destination, you can get out of your car and think, does the weather look like it was forecast? How do I feel? How does the group feel? Has anybody forgotten anything? And then whilst you're on your journey, you can then plan to have key places at particular locations. Moving up the mountain, you can then start to sort of see where you're wanting to go from your plan that you had. Maybe at the bottom of a ridge line, you can start to see if the snow has been blown away and the ridge is exposed and potentially safe to travel. And then depending on your time, if you started late in the day or how you're feeling, how the group is feeling that you're with, you can make key places to either head back down the mountain. The conditions may have deteriorated or gotten worse, or if you're feeling good and the weather's good and the snow conditions are safe to be out, you can carry on up to your destination. So bringing it kind of all together, there's lots to think about in making consistently good decisions, and it starts from the planning of the day. And this checklist that we have in the decision-making protocol really helps just hopefully to get your mind into that sort of direction of what you need to do, rather than just winging it and hope for the best. And a bit of an analogy I want to kind of get you to think about is the difference between cleaning your teeth and going on holiday. Cleaning your teeth, you don't plan to clean your teeth, you just do it after your meal or before your meal or whenever you get up. It's kind of an inbuilt thing from doing it for so many years that you just do it because you know that you need to do it. You don't plan about doing it. Where if you go on holiday, you plan to go on holiday, you look at the country you want to go, you look at creating an itinerary, you want to make sure you're not going to get lost in that country, you maybe want to know a little bit about the history, about the language, you put a lot of effort into your holiday that you do. So if you do that for going off on a holiday, why not do it for going out in the mountains? You don't just hope for the best and head out in the mountains that you're going to play it safe and just, and wing it because you've been doing it for years. You got to put the effort in, you got to plan and spend the time making sure you're getting everything right. So just going back to this idea about making consistently good decisions and asking relevant questions whenever you're planning, and also whilst you're out on the mountain, some considerations and some questions to think about are: have you identified the angle, the aspect, and the altitude of hazardous terrain? And what are the associated hazards in that forecast that you're looking at? Is it an increase in temperature? Is it cornices potentially prone to collapse? Is it a persistent weak layer of snow somewhere? Those types of questions. Is the snow stable? Is it unsafe? Are you putting yourself into avalanche terrain? And could somebody else possibly trigger an avalanche, whether they're with you in a group or somebody else in your surroundings? So you're constantly asking these questions prior to being on the mountain and whilst you're also out on the mountainside. So whatever your chosen choice of activity is, whether it's mountaineering, hill walking, skiing, or going climbing, if you plan to go out on the mountains and you get a forecast that looks something like that, question yourself and think, what is the probability of success versus the consequences of failure? And what is your level of skill and knowledge to be in that environment? So if you feel uncomfortable and you can't answer those questions, then it's probably not a good idea to venture out into the mountains when you have a forecast that looks like that. You might want to wait for those days that there's low risk, that it's more manageable, and that you feel that your skill and your level of awareness is in par or is equal to what the forecast is giving you for that day. The mountains will always be there. Don't take the risk and don't gamble it. I think it's all very well and good having a a plan in place and doing all of that. But I think it's a really good idea to have someone to hold you accountable for what you do, and having a little bit of a laid back policy, and just giving some information to let people know where you are, where you're going, and what time you plan to be off the hill. Because you could have gotten off the hill a little bit later and decided to go to the pub or get some fish and chips and completely forgot to let somebody know that you're back safely. So maybe just having something like that in place is a really good idea. And just to kind of finish with, thinking about technology and how amazingly useful it is nowadays, and we're all using it to navigate our way around the hill. I know I use it a lot of the time, but my map and compass is always still with me. But we have technology that we can use to help get grid references, to help sort of navigate with. So if you have something like OS Locate, it can help give a grid reference to then relay that to emergency services, or just to help you relocate yourself where you are in the mountain if you feel a little bit misplaced. I never want to say lost. It has a sense of permanence. You're just maybe navigationally embarrassed one day. So having a useful tool, using an app on your phone or your watch, whatever it might be, is a really useful thing to have. But be aware and bear in mind that it's only as good as the battery that it has. If at the end of the day, everything is going against you in your plan, and even on the mountain you think this is not a good idea, just go home and stick the kettle on. The mountains will always be there, and there's always another day. Thank you very much. So now is the time to ask any other questions, or I can have a look in the Q&A and see what some of the questions are that people have asked. So just looking at a question here about what happened or what has happened when really experienced people end up triggering an avalanche, and that's a very good question. You can have all the experience and knowledge in the world, and you can still get caught out, and sometimes that can be down to what we would call heuristics, or heuristic traps, kind of like mental shortcuts that we would take. And in day-to-day life, they can be really useful because it can help to make quick decisions in an emergency. Other times they can be detrimental. And some of these heuristic traps can be familiarity, where you could have gone to an area that you know very well. You've gone to a particular climb or a particular slope, and you think, I've been here hundreds of times before, and I know that this slope has never avalanched on me before, so I'm going to presume that it's safe to be here. But the mountain and the snow combined together isn't going to say, yes, I'm a safe place to be. Things will always change. It's just our shortcuts that we take that can catch us out. So that's why it's really important to have good plans and question your actions whenever you're out, either by yourself or with someone else, and verbalize your thought process, and always just think before you leap into somewhere. Another heuristic trap could be acceptance, or kind of social proof that you see tracks or footprints in the snow, and you think, oh, somebody's been here before, so it must be safe to be here. I'll just follow these tracks, and then end up leading you into potential hazard or danger. So never presume that footprints or ski tracks are heading off in the right direction. Always kind of take that little bit of extra time to think about, where do they go, and do I want to go that way? So thanks for that question. So another question was, any watches to assist navigation? There are plenty of watches to choose from the likes of Suunto, Garmin, Polar, there's Coros as well. And it's quite a complicated subject, but I would say that one that you're familiar with, spend the time looking into, and one that's simplistic to use. You don't want to be going through loads of different menus to try and find, you know, that bit that's going to give you a grid reference. Something that's very simple to use as well. So they all have similar functions. It's just personal preference. There's a very good question. So, is there still much risk of avalanche on the southern monument rows that aren't covered by SIS? So, there are 6 areas within Scotland that are covered by the SAIS, and there are areas that are outside of those areas. So, for example, I was in Glen Shiel a number of weeks ago and did Fork and Ridge, and it's outside of any of the areas. But the closest areas to that are Craigmeggy and Lochaber, which is the west. So you kind of have to look at the forecasts that are as close to the area and then go with that. But you've also got to use your own judgment and look at the warning signs and look at the signs of the mountain that you're getting in that area and thinking, if the wind is coming from the west, then all that snow is going to be on easterly aspects on the mountain. So if I'm going into this area, I'm going to start thinking about those easterly slopes, and then you can start to hopefully see where the snow is lying, and then you can, you know, avoid those slopes. But it's going into that area with as much knowledge and information from those surrounding forecast areas that are going to help with all that. Lots and lots of really good questions there. You know, so thank you very much. So another question there, I'll just finish with this one. Is Spat Maps useful for route planning? Yes, it's a very useful map app that you can get for your phone or your computer. Certainly, I use it as well when I'm planning, looking at the map and you know where I want to go and trying to overlay it on top of an OS map. It just helps to kind of give a more visual picture as well, because I think it's much easier to sort of see visually what's happening rather than trying to paint a picture in your mind. If you've got it in front of you on a computer, it's much easier. I'll finish with this last question. Do you recommend snowshoes for Scottish hills? Yeah, that can be useful. It can be great if you don't want to spend a fortune on buying skis for ski touring and getting access into places. Certainly with the amount of snow that we've had through January, lots of people have been out on snowshoes. So they're a good way to help navigate through really deep snow and hard snow that's hard to move across. So yeah, snowshoes are great. Yeah. So folks, thank you very much for joining us this evening for tonight's talk. I hope it has been useful to everyone. And I would just like to say that if you have any other further questions, Myself and Heather, or anyone at Mountaineering Scotland, we're always there to help, and that's kind of what we're here for, is to help you to have safer days in the mountains. So if you want to look at looking onto a course later down the line, or just ask a general question on certain things, please do drop us a line. We'll always do our best to answer any questions that we can. So again, thank you for joining this evening, and stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks now.